Good morning, this is Scott Amyx, and I'm joined by Chrissa McFarlane, CEO of Patientory. Chrissa, welcome.
Thank you for having me, Scott.
All right, so why don't we get started with your background a little bit? You've had a very diverse, kind of an unusual background that eventually led to a dApp and an ICO and Patientory. So maybe you just kind of take a step back and walk us through that journey.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I started out in healthcare. I was pre-med, wanted to go into medicine and practice medicine because I had, started out doing research and wanted to get more of a practical feel in applying, research to society. Then I, went to business school and got introduced to healthcare management, where I went into health IT consultant, right around the time when EMR integration, was a big push in our country. So got to see that. Then got poached to work for a telemedicine digital healthcare startup that was founded by a co-founder who went to my alma mater. So I went to Cornell. And I fell in love with digital, healthcare entrepreneurship. Saw the problems facing healthcare, which is, lack of access to patient data, that interoperability that actually arose out of, the push for digitization of medical information. And that's how, all those experiences led me to start Patientory.
Yeah. Actually, it kind of makes sense. Electronic medical records, the integration of data, and then of course, as soon as you talk about transmitting that data from MedTech and wearables and telemedicine, it does raise a host of issues. So my first follow-up question then is, doesn't the current HIPAA framework and data requirement framework already help facilitate that? Why do we need a different type of innovation or a different type of technology standard?
Yeah, well, HIPAA, which was, actually created to protect the interests of, individuals and their health information. We see the large vendors as actually use that to, block data. As we see, it continues that spirit of competition, but at the same time, people don't have access to the information. It's just a hurdle for them to take that information elsewhere or share it with other providers that they might see, especially if they're suffering from chronic illnesses. So while HIPAA is there, I think, the framework that's being, developed now, especially with the 21st Century Cures Act, which basically bans data blocking. We're starting to see more technologies like blockchain, AI, machine learning, that actually helps aggregate this information. But again, it goes back to, how it's being implemented. And we really see blockchain as that underlying infrastructure that can assist with that.
So underlying this conversation, what we're really talking about is this notion of centralization to decentralization. The fact that a lot of these medical records, or let's call it the middle and back office system players, are proprietary, and they want to keep that data in their systems proprietary and locked and closed. Mm-hmm. Similarly, on the hospitals and physician groups, they tend to be oligopolies or monopolies, so they want to hold on to and put these closed gardens around it. So the issue of what you're saying is that the patients don't necessarily have true ownership, and that the data that truly belongs to them isn't really easily transportable to the ecosystem of service providers and health providers that really needs to get involved in that holistic care. Am I understanding correctly?
That's exactly the issue.
Okay.
Well said.
So then that brings up the topic of blockchain. And I think I just want to delineate for the audience, we're not talking about cryptocurrencies, at least not yet, because we're going to talk about ICO. But for the time being, we're talking about the underlying cryptography that uses a hash function. So talk to us about how you went about using blockchain And did you develop the smart contracts and some of the rules internally, or did you contract that out?
Absolutely. So our team, we do have I would say an external contract team that works for us full time internally. Um, Basically, how we use the blockchain is more as a means for tracking of integration between these legacy and siloed infrastructure data management systems for the medical records. But in turn, with the smart contracts and this creation and this notion of a public-private key, we can start to give ownership and data autonomy to the individual. So we actually developed it. We're a modified Ethereum blockchain network that our team created, which right now integrates into the top 4 electronic medical records.
Yeah, terrific. So by putting onto Ethereum and into the decentralized blockchain technology protocol, now basically the data can float to anybody that the patient with the private key then permissions to allow for that person or entity to be able to have access to. The other thing that's a side benefit is that because we're generating so much data, not just medical data, but just fitness and just general health data, there are companies that's looking to harness it and you know create a kind of a proprietary ecosystem, much like what Facebook has done. So this allows for the ownership and the auditability of the trail of the data, so that my data, your data, we can trace it, we know who's using it, how they're using it, and if in fact they're using it for monetary purposes, we either give permission as well as ability to be able to actually have some sort of monetary compensation back to us as well, right?
Yeah.
Okay, without getting too much into the actual technology, uh, what part of the product have you guys already built out? Where are you guys in terms of the sales pipeline and the journey to profitability?
Absolutely. And it's been a long journey for sure. Right now, we have our network, which is actually sits within an association. So we have the Patientory Association, which is a member-driven organization for healthcare institutions, startups that adopt our blockchain network, which of course is a free open source access network. Right now we have some support and storage providers on that network within that membership ecosystem. And we have about 3 startups that are building their use cases for healthcare on top of that, including Patientory Inc., and our use of the network for more population health management initiatives. We have a beta version as well of the app that runs on this network, where we did actually a case study that's available on our website at patientory.com with about over 300 beta users so far. And right now we're in the process of building and finalizing the population health management enterprise software, which is more of an analytics focus software that's able to, again, aggregate data around certain individuals to help providers better manage their patient population.
Well, it sounds like you guys are really building out some core functionalities and modules that's absolutely necessary for this network to perform well and be useful to the multi-parties that's involved. Let's kind of lead up into the ICO, but let me just kind of back off a little bit in the sense of starting from more foundational. The fact that you are a woman co-founder, the fact that you're a person of color, there are some real challenges. So for example, I recently interviewed a Caucasian woman who has had 3 children through the in vitro fertilization method. And for her to start her IVF startup, she explained that it was so difficult to be able to convey to the typical white venture capitalist, male dominated, to explain to them around family technology. So tell us about your experience as a person of color, as a person, as a woman gender.
Yeah, I mean, and there's not a lot of us actually. I just published a book called Future Woman, which actually talks about my journey, just, in the road to funding, which was, it's out in Amazon today, actually. But it was tough. I started the company in 2015. As you know, no one was talking about enterprise blockchain adoption. That was like, I think Ethereum had done their ICO, that same year. So the concept about, bringing blockchain services to mainstream industry was non-existent. So pitching during that time was actually pretty difficult. I had reached out to over like 500 VCs. I had won many pitch competitions, but it never equated into actual investments. Especially being a woman of color in the space, we don't see too many, at least, 5 years ago, building companies. And I think now it's starting to change as we start to highlight, the possibilities, especially women of color, in the field building, tech companies. So that was also a challenge. I think, from that experience, it was just never a common theme in connecting, like you mentioned, with these white VCs, to actually say, oh, this is a new industry. The feedback I got was it was always a bit too early for them. And just seeing, over the past decade, about, $500 billion, only less than 2% of that went to Black women. So I was, I'm definitely up against a challenge with that. But with Patientory, in garnering the success from the ICO, I was able to build a community who really saw the need for the technology in the space, and it really resonated them. So that has been, such a success for us in helping us get to the next stage of development. And then as we continue to build, and, right now we're working with the Oregon Enterprise Blockchain Venture Studio as one of their first 6 companies in the state of Oregon to, spearhead this initiative with their healthcare partners. We hope that would start to also break down the barriers and get interested partners a part of our mission.
Yeah, I wish we had a little bit more time to delve, because ICO in itself is actually fairly complex. And just for the audience that is less familiar with it, ICO stands for Initial Coin Offering, and the nature of it has changed quite a bit in the last couple of years. Where in the, I would say, let's say 2016, 2017, it was somewhat of a wild west, and the regulatory framework was still being defined, and you had a lot of unscrupulous but also reasonable startups going through that process. Mm-hmm. As of last year, and certainly this year, things have gotten tightened up quite a bit. So the barrier to enter into ICO is becoming harder, and it's becoming more like an IPO, but of course not with the kind of revenue volume that we would typically see with an IPO of 100 million plus. Mm-hmm. So the environment has changed. So it's, talk to us a little bit about the time frame that you went through the ICO, what was the experience? And then the other thing that, that you have to be thinking about is some of the macroeconomic trends, the pending recession, whether it's a year or 2 years or 3 years from now, and what that means from managing your cash flow, because too many of the ICO funded startups have really gone to the wayside because they've really poorly used their money, because they were really not fundamentally strong, rigorous startups to begin with. Yeah. Second is the halving event that's going to be expected next year, where the Bitcoin quantity is going to shrink by half. And what does that mean for your value as well? So
absolutely. Yeah. So, Scott, you definitely hit a lot of key points there. We did our token sale. We started to prepare actually late 2016. We had scheduled ours for, that Q2 of 2017, and kind of shifted to late May, early June of 2017. So I say we were one of the first, I would say probably 20 that came out in 2017, which just started. So by June, we started to see that momentum, companies like Patientory, basic attention token, they were raising, storage, they were raising, capital, and then it just blew up into this funding event where people were like, oh, I can write a white paper and, actually promote this and potentially make some money, to the point where we actually had a company in Russia that copied our white paper verbatim, just changed the front cover, and managed to raise over $2 million. We were like,
Oh, this is
this
ridiculous.
this is ridiculous.
Yeah.
So yeah, we were definitely one of the pioneers in that space. And I actually went that route because of my experiences in the early stage venture capital, arena. Whereas most people were like, "Oh, this is the Wild Wild West. We're going to take advantage of this." So I definitely saw that there are companies that are still existing today that were early, enough, but they're very, I would say, intentional in how, with the use of proceeds, they actually have a team that manages that. So there are good companies that come out of this, funding event, whereas most, you just saw it as a liquidity opportunity. With the Bitcoin halving, some say it's going to increase the price. I don't really speculate on the price of the token. Some say, it's going to decrease. But overall, with that, it's definitely going to change the current environment of cryptocurrencies in general. I think we're going to see a lot more cleanup of the space with that. And hopefully by then we can start to see, more companies gain traction, especially as regulations start to pick up with the innovators and the entrepreneurs in the space.
Sounds great. Again, this conversation wasn't really meant to be just around ICO, but it is kind of fundamental to your funding strategy. So my last question for you is, what was your greatest product or maybe even career failure and the lessons learned from that?
Yeah, I think, my greatest career failure is what actually led me to Patientory, which I feel I've gotten so much feedback from women of color, from, white venture capitalists in the space, that you're doing, something great, right? And I think that failure came from my last experience with that startup, that digital healthcare startup that I fell so much in love with, but learned so much at the same time, from dealing with VCs, and just building the right team. The first 10 people, can really make or break your company. So I would say failure in that, opportunity, when it didn't work out, and I was like, oh, it was actually more of a learning experience for me, which has given me the tenacity and the drive. I mean, next year would be, I would say, 5 years since Patientory has been going, and everyone sees us as this healthcare pioneer in this space. And it has actually made me wiser in how to build a company, in an emergent space, because it's so different than building a company in a market that already exists.
Terrific. So I've been joined by Pioneer Chrissa McFarlane, CEO of Patientory. Chrissa, thank you for sharing today.
Thank you so much again, Scott.